This is American Dissident Voices. Your host is Kevin Alfred Strom.
What is it like to live in a third world nation? If Americans and Europeans do not wake up to the theft of their civilization soon, I assure you that you and your children are going to find out sooner than you think. Consider this radio program, which I entitle The Descent, to be a warning. We haven't heard much about the new South Africa since the much ballyhooed takeover there by black communists. You'd think the controlled media would be falling all over themselves to let us know how well things are going there since the evil whites were removed from power, and terrorist bomber and necklacing enthusiast Nelson How to Be a Good Communist Mandela was installed with the help of your tax money and mine. The reason you haven't heard very much about it is that the news there is almost all bad. The once most prosperous and civilized nation of Africa is headed the way of all black African states, downhill, fast. For you see, that nation was prosperous and civilized because of the character of its dominant European population. The whites abdicated, and what for all practical purposes may be considered their suicide will probably be consummated in the next decade or two. As the wealthier whites leave the country in droves, South Africa is already complaining about the resultant brain drain, which means that jobs that need to be done just to maintain civilized life are now being done poorly or not at all. As the economy there goes into a tailspin under black control, the size of the economic pie that the communist ANC promised to divide up among the savages and barbarians is shrinking, and the extravagant promises made to the ignorant become impossible to fulfill. Some of the natives are becoming very restless indeed, setting the stage for increasing confiscation of the wealth and property of the remaining whites, after which the cycle will be repeated again and again until there is no more wealth to confiscate and the rotting bodies litter the street. As the black communists of the ANC take over the police force, corruption becomes the rule of the day, and lawlessness, brute force, and violence the commonplaces of the streets and highways. Over the last few months, it has been reported that gangs of black hijackers, dressed as South African National Police, were terrorizing motorists along major roads in the Orange Free State. Investigators have finally had to admit what the nasty racists had been saying all along. The black hijackers were not just dressed as South African National Police. The hijackers were South African National Police. That this has been going on for many months before the truth was officially admitted shows the degree to which the new anti-apartheid regime covers up for its own. Official spokesmen blame the problem on low pay and the legacy of white racism. More investigations have been promised, of course, but it is doubtful that anything is going to change unless the whites rise up and retake their nation, a move that the current managers of the United States probably would oppose with military force. The murder rate in the new South Africa has increased since the communist ANC was installed with our help and is now officially admitted to be 5 times higher than that of the United States. No slackers, the resourceful Brotherhood commandos of the South African National Police are taking advantage of that situation and are now making a few rand extra on the side, again undoubtedly due to low pay and white racism, by selling the body parts of murder victims on the black market. Some of those parts probably make their way to voodoo practitioners who, I am sure, make big magic with the sawed-off hands and heads and arms. It will take bigger magic than that, though, to save white South Africans and their children from a death that they brought upon themselves by believing in the lie of racial equality. That is the reality of the descent into the third world. That is what you are bequeathing to your children when you believe in the lie of racial equality. In Southern California, writer Ron Culver reports that an officially approved and taxpayer-purchased textbook called Mexican American Heritage is now being used in the public schools. This book teaches our children that 7 southwestern U.S. states were taken from Mexico under, quote, questionable circumstances, close quote. It teaches our children that these states constitute a land called Aztlan, and that Aztlan's Mexicans will soon retake Aztlan from their white oppressors. A student movement based on the two concepts of Aztlan and communist revolution, called MICA, or Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlan, has chapters on high school and college campuses all over the United States, again, funded by your tax and tuition dollars. The great fortunes and corporations of the United States have been compromised by America's enemies and have made their deal with them in return for a place at the table in the New World Order. It was the Ford Foundation, for example, which funded much of the opposition to California's Proposition 187. Proposition 187 was a proposal approved by the California voters, which, if it had been allowed to stand by the corrupt judges, would have taken a few tax-funded benefits away from the illegal invaders of that state. The Ford Foundation was the creator of both the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund and the National Council of La Raza, which means literally the race. Allied with the Ford Foundation in these enterprises was the communist-associated ACLU, the Communist Front National Lawyers Guild, and a group called United Latin American Citizens. The Ford Foundation spent over $32 million in its efforts to circumvent the wishes of the voters of California. In her lonely efforts to fight the well-funded invasion lobby, Santa Barbara School Board member Sandy Beckers did us the service of placing the statements of the Chicano invaders in the public record. Excerpted statement of Sandy Beckers begins. On 90% of the public high school, college, and university campuses in the southwestern U.S., there is a group called MICA. There are MICA groups on each of the Santa Barbara high school campuses. The preamble to the MICA Constitution states that, quote, Chicano students of California must politicize our raza, or race, and continue the struggle for self-determination of the Chicano people and the liberation of the nation of Aztlan, close quote. Aztlan is considered to be the 7 southwestern states in the U.S., including California. A few excerpts from the recently board-approved textbook, Mexican American Heritage, for the Chicano studies classes at all 3 high schools follows. Quote, Mexican American intellectuals have argued that if Mexico is to allow the U.S. to invest in Mexico and send American products freely into the land to the south, then Mexico should in turn be allowed to freely export one of its most marketable commodities to the United States, Mexican labor. Close X.